A woman rides alone through Texas dust at noon. No escort, no explanation. Straight to the door of a man the whole town has quietly pitied for 11 years. She doesn't knock. She waits on her horse until he comes out, squinting against the sun, wiping grease from his hands. And then she says 4 words that will change everything in Red Creek. I need a husband. Not a whisper. Not a question. A statement. Calm and desperate at the same time, the way a person sounds when they've run out of every other option. Wade Mercer just stares at her. And somewhere across town, a sheriff with a badge and a bad temper is about to realize he just made the worst mistake of his life. If this story grabs you, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rooster at Wade Mercer's ranch had been dead for 3 years, but he still woke before sunrise out of pure habit. He lay on his back in the dark, staring at a ceiling he knew better than his own face in a mirror, listening to the sounds his property made at that hour. The low complaint of cattle settling in the pen, the creak of the windmill turning lazy in a breeze too weak to matter, the occasional pop of the old house contracting in the pre-dawn cold. He had memorized every one of those sounds, had nothing else to fill his ears with. He was 34 years old. He had been living alone since he was 23. Wade swung his legs off the bed and sat up in one motion, the way a man does when he stopped expecting sleep to be comfortable a long time ago. He pulled on his work trousers, his flannel shirt that had lost 2 buttons off the left cuff, his boots. He didn't light a lamp. He knew the floor. Outside, the sky was still black with a thin bruise of purple along the eastern ridge. He went to the well, drew water, splashed it on his face without ceremony. It was cold enough to sting. He didn't flinch. You stopped flinching at cold water around the same time you stopped expecting mornings to feel good. The work began. It always began. That was the one reliable thing about Wade's life. The work was always there, patient as stone, waiting for him. Feed the horses. Check the water line at the south pasture. Mend the section of fence that his gray gelding, a disagreeable animal named Coat, had been leaning against for the past week and would eventually collapse if not reinforced. Patch the trough that had developed a slow seep around the bottom fitting. Move 20 head of cattle from the east grazing to the north because the east was going dry. He did all of this mostly without thinking, his hands working while his mind stayed quiet. That was the discipline he had built over 11 years. A kind of deliberate emptiness. Not unhappiness exactly, just the practiced art of wanting very little so that very little was what he needed. The town of Red Creek was 4 miles east. He rode in twice a week for supplies and necessities. People there treated him decently enough. Mr. Mercer at the feed store, nod from the barber, occasionally a brief conversation about weather or cattle prices with one of the other ranchers who ran operations nearby. He was known as honest. That was the word they used, honest, like it was a consolation prize. He had overheard a woman at Navarro's Mercantile tell another woman once, not knowing he was in the next aisle, that it was such a shame about Wade Mercer, such a good man, hard-working, but some men were just not meant to have a family. He had stood there with a sack of flour in his hands and let that settle into him quietly, the way cold water settles into dry soil. Then he bought his flour and walked out. He had not thought about that conversation again, or told himself he hadn't. Thought? It was past noon when he heard hoofbeats on the road coming up to the house. He was on his knees at the trough, forearms deep in the mud trying to work a wrench around a fitting that had seized from rust, and he was in the specific kind of foul mood that comes from a task that should take 20 minutes dragging into its second hour. He pulled his arms out and stood, wiping mud from his hands onto his work pants, and looked toward the road. A bay mare came up the track at a steady trot. The rider was a woman. He didn't recognize her at first because of the hat, a wide-brimmed thing pulled low against the midday sun, but when she slowed the horse near the fence line and looked at him, he recognized her. Sophia Navarro. He knew who she was the way everyone in a small town knows everyone, by sight, by name, by association. Daughter of Ernesto Navarro, who ran the Mercantile. She was maybe 25, 26. Dark hair, dark eyes. He had seen her behind the counter at the store a handful of times, mostly watching transactions her father conducted while she kept the ledger. She had a composed quality that he had noticed without thinking much about it, the kind of composure that comes not from ease but from practice. He had never spoken to her beyond a greeting. She brought her horse to a stop at his fence and looked at him from the saddle. She did not dismount immediately. She seemed to be deciding something. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Miss Navarro." A pause. The kind of pause that has weight in it. "I need to speak with you," she said, "about something important." He looked at his mud-caked arms, his ruined work pants, the general disaster of his afternoon. "All right," he said. "I can offer you water and a place to sit that won't give you a splinter." She swung down from the horse with the practiced ease of someone who had been riding since before she could read, tied the mare to his post, and followed him to the porch. He brought out the wooden chair he kept by the door for the rare occasion he sat outside in the evening, and a second stool from inside. He pumped water from the kitchen well, poured it in 2 tin cups, and came back out. She was sitting very straight in the chair, hands in her lap, hat now removed and held between her fingers. Her hair was pinned up at the back of her neck. She looked like someone about to say something she had rehearsed, and he got the distinct impression she was hoping the rehearsal held. He sat on the stool and handed her the cup. "Thank you," she said, and didn't drink it. He waited. "I'll be direct with you," she said, "because I think you're a man who would prefer that." "Generally." She looked at him steadily. "I want to ask if you'd consider marrying me." The afternoon held very still for a moment. The windmill turned. A crow called somewhere over the pasture. "That's direct," he said. "I told you I would be." He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them looked away, and he noticed that her composure, the steady quality he had associated with her from a distance, was real. She wasn't performing calm. She was holding herself to it the way a person grips something when the ground moves under them. "I think," he said carefully, "that you'd better explain the full situation to me." She exhaled slowly, set the cup down on the porch railing. "My father's business," she said. "You know it, the mercantile. I shop there. For the past 4 years, Sheriff Rourke has been taking money from my father, every month. He says it's a fee, for protection, for being allowed to operate." Her jaw tightened on that last word. "My father has paid it because he built that business over 20 years and he is afraid. Because Rourke has shut down other businesses in this county when their owners didn't cooperate. Because 2 men who refused him ended up with their places burned or their licenses pulled on invented violations." Wade was quiet. None of this was exactly news to him. Not the specific details, but the general shape of it. He had sensed something wrong about Calvin Rourke since the man was appointed sheriff 3 years back. There was a quality to how Rourke moved through town, a certain proprietary ease, like a man who knew exactly which doors he could open and which people he could lean on. Wade had filed it away in that careful, observant part of himself that he mostly kept to himself. "Go on," he said. "2 months ago Rourke came to the store," Sophia said. "My father wasn't there. I was minding the counter." She stopped, adjusted her grip on her hat. "He wasn't there for money that time." The way she said it made the temperature drop a few degrees. "He was there for me." She said it without decoration, without drama, just as a plain fact, and somehow that made it worse. Wade watched her face and saw the very precise effort she was making to maintain that composure, and he felt something shift in his chest. Not pity exactly, because she was not asking for pity, but a kind of clear-eyed anger that settled into his bones and stayed. "He didn't," she said, then stopped, started again. "He didn't do anything. I was not alone, but he made it clear." She looked at her hands. "He said a woman like me shouldn't have to work in a shop. Said he could make my life very comfortable. Said my father's business troubles could disappear overnight if I was willing to be reasonable." The word reasonable came out like something that had a bad taste. "I told him no," she said. "He smiled like I'd said something amusing and told me to think on it." She looked up at Wade. He came back 2 weeks later. My father was there that time. Rourke behaved perfectly, courteous. But he looked at me across the counter the entire time, and I knew exactly what he was saying without saying it. She drew a slow breath. "My father doesn't know what Rourke said to me when we were alone. My father would do something rash and Rourke would destroy him. Maybe worse." "So you've been carrying this alone," Wade said. "I've been thinking," she corrected quietly. "There's a difference." He acknowledged that with a slight nod. I can't leave, she said. My mother passed 5 years ago. My father is the only family I have, and this business is everything he has. I can't convince him to leave without telling him why, and if I tell him why, she shook her head. So I thought about what would actually stop Rourke. What kind of obstacle would make him calculate that I was not worth the trouble? A husband, Wade said. Not just any husband. She looked at him with those steady, dark eyes. A man Rourke would actually have to think about before he moved against. A man with land, with a reputation for honesty that the town respects. A man who is not afraid of conflict and who is not indebted to anyone. A pause. I've been watching how people talk about you, Mr. Mercer. For a man who keeps to himself, you have a very particular reputation. Wade was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this carefully, he said, for 6 weeks. And what exactly are you proposing, the arrangement? She was ready for that question. A legal marriage. My presence here would give your ranch some practical advantages. I can keep accounts, which I understand are not your strongest skill. No offense meant. None taken. They're not. I can cook. I can manage a household and assist with calving season and other operations. I'm not fragile and I'm not useless. In return, I need the legal protection of a husband's name and whatever practical protection that provides against Rourke. She held his gaze. I want to be honest with you. I am not in love with you. I don't know you well enough for that. I'm not asking for romance. I'm asking for a partnership and for your protection, and I believe I can offer you something real in return. She stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. One question, he said. All right. Why me specifically? There are other men in this county who own land, who have reputations. Something shifted in her expression, barely, just a slight adjustment at the corners of her eyes. Because, she said, you've shopped at my father's store for years, and you have never once been rude, impatient, or condescending to me or to him. Because last spring, when old Marcus Tatum was drunk and talking badly about my family in the street, you told him to stop, and you only said it once, and he stopped. She paused. And because I think you are lonely enough to understand what it means to want something real rather than something easy. That landed somewhere close to center in him. He didn't show it, but she might have seen something in his face anyway, because she added quietly, I'm sorry. That was too much. No, he said. That was honest. He looked out at the pasture for a moment. You want an answer now? I'd rather have an honest answer later than a hasty one now. He nodded slowly. Then he looked back at her. Come back tomorrow morning. I'll have one for you. She stood, picked up her hat. Thank you for listening. You did the hard part, he said. I just sat here. She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. He watched her ride back down the road until the dust settled behind her. Then he sat on the porch steps for a very long time. He did not sleep much that night. He sat at the kitchen table with a lamp going, a cup of coffee that went cold without him drinking it, and he thought, not in spirals, not in anxious loops, but in the deliberate, methodical way he thought about anything that required serious consideration, laying it out like pieces of fence, checking each one, deciding what was sound and what needed to be replaced. The risks were clear. Rourke had a badge and 4 deputies and a grudge against anyone he considered a challenge to his authority. Marrying Sophia would put Wade directly in that line of sight. There was no version of this where Rourke simply accepted it and moved on. Wade understood that about men like Rourke instinctively. They didn't retreat. They escalated. He thought about the cattle in the south pasture. He thought about the fence line he'd spent 3 years improving. He thought about the work he had put into this land and what it would mean if a corrupt sheriff decided to make it his business to dismantle it. He thought about Sophia Navarro sitting very straight in a wooden chair with her hat in her hands, saying, I'm not asking for romance, with the steady voice of someone who has already given up a thing she might have wanted once, in order to deal with what was actually in front of her. He thought about the look on Rourke's face the few times he had seen the man in town. That particular look of a man who believed he had solved the problem of other people and figured out exactly how much pressure to apply and where. He thought about what the woman in Navarro's mercantile had said. Some men are just not meant to have a family. He got up, poured the cold coffee out, and went to bed. He had made his decision. He just needed morning to deliver it properly. She came at 8 o'clock, same bay mare, same straight-backed riding posture. He was waiting on the porch. "Yes," he said, before she'd fully dismounted. She paused with one foot out of the stirrup and looked at him. "Just like that?" she said. "I thought about it all night. Answer's yes." She finished dismounting, tied her horse, walked to the porch, stood in front of him. "I want you to understand," she said, "what you'd be walking into. Rourke will come after me. Yes, he'll try to discredit me, probably try to damage the ranch. Almost certainly. He won't stop at a warning." "No," she said. "He won't." Wade looked at her evenly. "Then I should tell you something too." "All right. I've had my own reasons to watch Rourke for about a year now. He's put pressure on a couple of the smaller ranchers east of town. Nothing as serious as what he's done to your father, but the same shape. I've been paying attention." Her eyes sharpened slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said carefully, "that if you and I are walking into this, I'm not walking in empty-handed. I've been keeping a record. Dates, names, what I've witnessed, and what others have told me directly." He looked at her steadily. "I was going to need a reason to act on it eventually. Seems like you just gave me one." For a moment she simply looked at him, then she said, "You were already building something." "I was building what I could build alone," he said, "which has limits." She was quiet. He watched her process that, adjust for it. "We should discuss terms," she said at last. "Practical terms." "We should," he agreed. "Come inside. I'll make fresh coffee and we can talk like adults." They went inside. They talked for 2 hours. Not all of it was comfortable. She told him what her father would need to hear, that this was Wade's idea, that he had approached her, because Ernesto Navarro was a proud man who would not accept his daughter proposing a marriage of convenience on his behalf. Wade agreed without hesitation. He had dealt with proud men before. He understood it. She asked about the ranch's finances, directly and without embarrassment. He told her equally directly, modest but sound. The cattle operation was sustainable. The land was paid off. He carried no debt. She listened and nodded and didn't express either relief or judgment. And he found he respected that. He showed her the spare room. It was mostly used for storage. She looked at it, said it would be fine, and did not make any particular comment about the arrangement itself. Neither did he. There were things that didn't need to be said when practical people were being practical. "I'll need a week," she said as she was leaving, "to prepare my father, to handle the things I need to handle." "Take what you need." She was at her horse. She looked back at him. "I want you to know," she said, "that I don't take this lightly. What you're doing." "Neither do I," he said. "That's why I said yes." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, the way you nod when words have done everything they can. He watched her ride away again. This time, the dust behind her felt different. The word got to Red Creek before Sophia had even reached her father's house. In a town of 1,100 people spread across ranches, farms, and the main street's 2-block cluster of commerce, news moved the way water moves through cracked ground, quickly, silently, finding every available path. By sundown, people were talking. By morning of the next day, it was everywhere. Wade Mercer is getting married. To Navarro's daughter. She rode out to his place. The reaction was varied, which is to say it was complicated, which is to say it was human. Martha Greer at the laundry told her neighbor it was the most romantic thing she had heard in years. A man like that, all those years alone, and suddenly love. The neighbor pointed out that nobody said anything about love. Martha said love didn't always announce itself, and she stood by that. Thomas Aldridge, who ran the second largest cattle operation in the county and had occasionally had conversations with Wade about grazing rights and water access, heard the news and felt something that surprised him, an uncomfortable admixture of gladness and envy. He had always thought well of Wade Mercer. He told his wife the man deserved some happiness. Benny Polk, who worked mornings at the feed store and spent his evenings drinking at the Red Creek Saloon and was constitutionally unable to let any piece of information pass through him without an editorial, told anyone who'd listened that he didn't understand it. Sophia Navarro was a beautiful woman. She could have anyone. Why some dried-up loner rancher? His opinion was received with the usual weight given to Benny Polk's opinions, which was very little. And in the sheriff's office on the east end of Main Street, Calvin Rourke sat behind his desk and listened to his deputy, a young man named Hector Flas, who was eager to please and slightly afraid of his employer, deliver the information. Rourke did not react immediately. He had the controlled quality of a man who had learned that the first reaction was usually the wrong one. He sat with his fingers laced on the desk in front of him and looked at a point somewhere past Hector's shoulder and thought. "Mercer," he said. "Yes, sir." "Wade Mercer. Out on the old Prescott Road." Rourke knew who Wade Mercer was. He made it his business to know everyone in his county with any standing: land, money, reputation, any one of those three. Mercer had all three in modest measure. More relevantly, he had a reputation for a quality Rourke found deeply irritating in other men. He was not afraid, not loudly brave, not the performing type of courageous, just not afraid. Rourke had seen it in the man's eyes the handful of times they'd spoken. That level gaze, that deliberate calm. It was the look of a man who had done the math on his own life and decided he could afford to be honest. Men like that were a problem. They didn't respond to the usual pressures. "When?" Rourke asked. "Don't know exactly when the wedding is, sir, just that it's set." Rourke nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "That's all, Hector." Hector left. Rourke sat alone in his office, and for the first time in perhaps 2 years, he felt the faint and unpleasant sensation of something slipping beyond his control. Sofia Navarro had been a project of patience. He had not rushed it, had not pushed too hard too fast, because he understood women like her, proud, composed, family loyal. You didn't grab that kind of woman. You made yourself inevitable. You applied pressure to the edges of her life until the center couldn't hold. He had been applying that pressure carefully. The monthly payments from Ernesto. The suggestion made directly to Sofia. The waiting game. He had another month, maybe 2, before he made his next move, and he'd been confident about the outcome. And then some lonesome rancher in a flannel shirt that was missing buttons had said yes to a proposal he hadn't even been there to witness. Rourke straightened his badge with one finger. He was not a man who lost things he had decided were his. He was not going to start now. Ernesto Navarro sat in the back of his mercantile with a cup of tea going cold in front of him and looked at his daughter for a long time after she finished telling him. He was 61 years old, a compact, precise man who kept his workspace in meticulous order and who had survived 2 drought years, 1 flood season, his wife's death, and 4 years of Calvin Rourke's so-called protection fees. He did not have Wade Mercer's stillness. He had the opposite quality. A kind of barely contained agitation that he managed through tidiness, through routine, through the careful arrangement of things he could control. He looked at his daughter. "Wade Mercer," he said. "Yes, Papa." "He came to you." She had agreed with Wade that this would be the story, that he had come to her. She held his gaze and said, "Yes, he came to the store while you were at the Halverson supply run." Ernesto was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it. "You don't know this man," he said. "I know his reputation. I know how he conducts himself, and I've spoken with him." She kept her voice level. "I think he's a good man." Her father looked at his tea. "A woman your age shouldn't have to settle for a rancher who—" "I'm not settling," she said, with just enough firmness to stop the sentence. "I'm choosing. There's a difference." He looked up at her. "Do you want this?" he asked. It was the question underneath all the others, and he asked it with the directness of a man who loved his daughter imperfectly but genuinely. She thought about Wade Mercer sitting on a porch stool with mud on his arms, listening to her without interrupting, without flinching, without making her feel either pitiable or foolish. "Yes," she said. Her father was quiet for another long moment. "He's honest," he said at last, less as a question than as a man going through what he knew. "People say so. He's never given me any trouble. Pays what he owes." Ernesto picked up his tea, found it cold, set it back down. "He comes in twice a week. Always says please and thank you." He paused. "Your mother would have opinions about whether that's enough." Mama would have talked to him for 30 minutes and known everything she needed to know. Her father's face did something complicated. He looked at his hands. "When?" he asked. "We haven't set the date yet. Soon. He nodded slowly. Then, after a moment, he pushed himself up from his chair and crossed the small distance and put his arms around her. She leaned into it the way she had been leaning into his hugs since she was 4 years old, imperfect, slightly awkward, entirely real. "You tell him," he said quietly, his chin on her hair, "that her father expects him to take care of her." "I'll tell him." "You tell him I'll be watching." "I'll tell him that too." Wade spent the following week working. This was not unusual, but the quality of the work was different. He was doing it with something forward-facing in him now, something that had been dormant long enough that he didn't quite recognize it at first. He cleaned the house properly, not just the functional surface-level cleaning of a man living alone, but the deep and thorough kind. He fixed the 2 steps on the porch that had been soft for a year. He whitewashed the fence sections along the front of the property. He cleared the junk from the spare room, found that beneath it was a room of reasonable size with a window that got afternoon light. And he thought that was something, anyway. He was not building anything dramatic. He was just preparing, getting things in order. It was the same part of himself that kept a careful record of what he observed about Rourke, the same methodical accumulation of detail and readiness. He did not believe in dramatic gestures. He believed in work done well and in time. On Wednesday, he rode into Red Creek for his regular supply run. He felt it before he could name it. The subtle shift in how people looked at him on the street. Not unfriendly, more like recalibration. He had been the lonely rancher for 11 years, which meant people had him filed in a particular place in their mental arrangement of the town, and now the filing system needed updating. Thomas Aldridge stopped him outside the feed store and shook his hand and said, "Congratulations," in the warm and slightly surprised way that suggested he meant it. Mrs. Greer at the laundry gave him an approving nod. The barber asked him when the wedding was, and when Wade said he didn't have a firm date yet, the barber said, "Well, you'll need a haircut when you do," and Wade said he supposed that was true. It was at the general store, not Navarro's, the other one on the south end, that he first heard something that made the back of his neck tighten. He was loading flour into a sack when he caught 2 men talking quietly near the back. He recognized one of them, Del Saunders, who ran a small beef operation 2 miles south of town and who had always been friendly enough but never quite friendly. The other man he didn't know well, someone's hired hand, he thought. "Rourke's not going to like it," Del was saying, low. "That ain't Mercer's concern." "Might be, real soon." Del's voice dropped further. "I'm just saying, a man picks a fight with the sheriff in this county, there's a cost to that." "Who said anything about a fight?" "You marry the girl Rourke's been courting. That's a fight whether you start it or not." There was a pause. Wade kept loading flour, keeping his movements easy and unhurried. "Mercer seems like a stubborn type," the other man said. "Yeah," Del agreed. "That's what worries me." Wade finished loading his sack and walked to the counter, paid for it, and left without engaging with what he'd overheard. He tied his supplies to coat, his disagreeable gray gelding, and stood for a moment on the street. Across the road, the sheriff's office sat with its single hitching post and its small square window facing the street. The window's curtain was closed. Rourke's horse wasn't at the post. Wade looked at that office for a moment. He thought about the journal he kept at home, tucked under the loose floorboard beneath his bed. 4 months of dates, names, observations. A rancher east of town named Pierce who'd told him about Rourke's men moving his cattle markers. Another man, a miller named Voss, who'd been threatened with a fire inspection for refusing to pay. What he himself had seen one night when Rourke's deputy Flass had leaned on old Marcus Tatum, who owed the saloon money that somehow ended up connected to the sheriff's office. Not enough. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. He had always known that. He was going to need more. He was going to need people willing to speak. He untied coat and swung up into the saddle, one thing at a time. Chet. The wedding was set for 6 weeks out, which was not as much time as either of them might have wanted, but more than they had expected to be comfortable with. Sophia came to the ranch 3 times in those weeks, each visit longer than the last. They talked about practical things mostly, the household, the accounts, how calving season worked, what her days would look like once she was living there. She had a directness to her that he found genuinely restful, which was not a thing he expected to find in another person. She did not fill silence with unnecessary words. When she had something to say, she said it, And when she didn't, she was quiet, and that turned out to be a quality he valued more than he had known. On her second visit, she brought his accounts ledger from the past year and went through it without asking, just sat at the kitchen table and went through it page by page. Then she looked up and said, "You've been overpaying at the feed store. $14 over the year." "I know," he said. "Henderson's arithmetic is not his strongest skill. Have you told him?" "I've corrected him each time it happens. He apologizes. Then it happens again." She looked back at the ledger. "I'll handle Henderson." Something about the matter-of-fact certainty of that made him want to smile. He didn't, quite. But it was close. On her third visit, she asked him about the journal. They were sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, and she asked the question in the same tone she might ask about a fence repair, just a practical inquiry into the status of something that mattered. "How much do you have?" she said. "Enough to interest someone who was already inclined to look into it," he said. "Not enough to compel someone who wasn't." "What would make it enough?" "More voices than mine," he said. "People who've been directly harmed and are willing to say so to someone with authority." He looked out at the pasture. "The problem is that Rourke has done a thorough job of making people afraid to speak." "Who would listen?" "If you found a way to bring this forward." "A circuit judge," he said. "Not the county judge. Harmon's in Rourke's pocket, or afraid of him, makes no difference which. But Judge Ambrose out of Laramie has been on the circuit through this district for years. He's retired now, but I wrote to him last month. Told him broadly what I'd observed." Sophia looked at him. "You wrote to a judge," she said. "Yes." "A month ago." "Yes." She looked at him a moment longer. "Before I came to you." "I told you I was already building something." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did he write back?" "Last week." He paused. "He's interested. He said if I could provide specifics and if other parties were willing to speak, he would make himself available." She absorbed this slowly. "So we need witnesses," she said. "We need people with enough courage and enough grievance," he said, "which is the same thing, more or less." She looked out at the pasture, at the long, slow light of a Texas afternoon going golden over dry grass. "My father," she said, "has 4 years of payments he made to Rourke. He kept records because he keeps records of everything. Amounts, dates." She paused. "He thinks he kept them in case he needed to protect himself. He doesn't know yet that they might protect all of us." Wade looked at her. "Has he agreed to that?" "He doesn't know I'm asking yet." She met his gaze. "I'll talk to him." He nodded slowly. "There's a risk," he said. "Once Rourke understands what's happening, he'll move against you," she said. "Against us." "Yes." "Then we need to move first," she said. "Or at least be ready when he does." The sun was getting low. The windmill threw a long shadow across the yard. Wade thought about 11 years of mornings starting before light. 11 years of work done without anyone watching. 11 years of building something solid and steady. And, "Sophia," he said. "Yes. I want you to know. This isn't only strategy for me. This—" He stopped, started again, more careful. "I want this to work. Not just the Rourke situation. I mean, the rest of it. I know you said it wasn't about romance, and I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying I'd like to actually know you as time goes on." She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was not soft, exactly, but it was open in a way that it hadn't been on that first afternoon. "I'd like that too," she said quietly. Neither of them said anything else about it, but something settled between them, something that had been slightly unsettled before, and the porch and the fading light and the sound of the windmill all felt a little different after that. 6 days before the wedding, a rancher named Pierce rode out to Wade's place. Pierce was a broad man in his early 50s, weathered the way men get weathered when they've lived outdoors their whole life, with the specific kind of squinted eyes that came from too many years reading the horizon. Wade had known him slightly for years. They had exchanged the nods and brief words of men who share a county and a livelihood, but not a social circle. Pierce dismounted at the gate and stood there. "Heard you're getting married," he said. "That's right." Pierce looked at the ground, looked at his hat in his hands. "I also heard you've been putting things together about Rourke." Wade didn't confirm or deny. He waited. Pierce looked up. 2 years ago, he said, Rourke's deputies moved my grazing boundary markers, gave my east pasture to a man named Curtis, who's been cooperating with Rourke's arrangement. When I went to the county office to contest it, the records showed the original survey as what they said. The original survey. He shook his head slowly. They'd changed the records. Wade was still. I couldn't prove otherwise because the evidence was gone, Pierce said. I ate the loss. Been eating it. He cleared his throat. I kept my own copies of the original survey. My wife made me keep everything, God bless her. I've still got them. Mr. Pierce, Wade said carefully. I'm not asking anything from you, Pierce said. I'm just telling you I've got paperwork. And I know 2 other men who have similar situations who I think would talk if someone put things in motion. He paused. If someone had a plan. Wade looked at him for a long moment. I've got a plan, he said. Pierce studied his face. Then he nodded once, with the slow deliberateness of a man who has made a hard decision and intends to live with it. I'll talk to those men, he said. You do that, Wade said, and then come back to me. Pierce put his hat back on, mounted his horse, turned to go, then stopped and looked back. Mercer, he said, what you're doing with that woman, with all of this? He stopped, seemed to find the right words. Not many men would. Not many men had the reasons I have, Wade said. Pierce rode away. Wade stood at the gate and watched him go. Inside the house, under the loose floorboard, the journal waited. It was getting heavier by the day. The wedding was on a Saturday. It was not a grand affair, and neither of them wanted it to be. The ceremony was held at the courthouse with Judge Henley presiding, a small, efficient man who had married 100 couples in that same room and had learned to read which ones wanted the short version. Wade and Sophia wanted the short version. Ernesto Navarro stood to Sophia's left in his good suit, the one he saved for occasions that mattered, and he kept his chin up the whole time with the particular stiff dignity of a man fighting emotions he had decided were private. There were 8 people in the room, that was all. Wade wore a clean shirt, his best one, which had all its buttons, and had gotten the haircut the barber had promised him. He stood at the front of that small room and watched Sophia walk the 10 feet from the door to his side, and he thought she looked like a person who had made a decision and was walking into it with both eyes open. He respected that more than he could have explained. She wore a pale blue dress that he later learned had been her mother's, taken in at the waist. When the judge asked Wade if he took this woman, Wade said, I do, in the same plain voice he used to answer most questions. And Sophia said the same, and then it was done, and they were married, and the 8 people in the room clapped, and Ernesto Navarro pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Afterward, on the steps of the courthouse, Ernesto pulled Wade aside. He was not a tall man, but he had a way of standing that made him seem larger than he was. You understand, Ernesto said quietly, in the direct way of a man who didn't believe in elaborate speeches, that she is not easy to know. She holds things close. I've noticed, Wade said. Her mother was the same. It is not coldness. It is... Ernesto searched for the word. She protects what matters. You will have to earn the inside of it. I understand. Ernesto studied him for a moment with dark eyes that had seen a good deal of life. Good, he said. And that was it. He shook Wade's hand once, firmly, and went back to his daughter. They drove back to the ranch in Wade's wagon with Sophia's 2 trunks loaded in the back. It was mid-afternoon. The road was dry. Neither of them said much. There was a quality to the silence that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, more like 2 people who had agreed on a direction and were simply in the process of moving. The spare room is yours, he said at one point. I know, she said. Another stretch of quiet. I moved the storage to the barn, he said. Got rid of what wasn't worth keeping. I saw, on my last visit, he nodded. She looked at the road ahead. When they pulled up to the ranch, she got down from the wagon before he could offer a hand, not rudely, just efficiently, the way she did most things. And she stood in the yard and looked at the property for a moment. The whitewashed fence, the patched porch steps, the windmill turning in a moderate afternoon breeze. It's a good piece of land, she said. I've tried to treat it that way. She picked up one of her trunks herself. He took the other, and they carried them inside, And the ranch that had belonged to one person for 11 years began, in the most quiet and mundane way possible, to belong to two. That night he heard her moving around in the spare room for a while before it went quiet. He lay in his own room and looked at the ceiling in the dark, and felt the strangeness of hearing another person's sounds in the house. Not unpleasant, just strange, like a word in a language you're only beginning to learn. He was asleep before he could think much more about it. The next morning she was up before he was. He came out of his room to find coffee already made and a pan of eggs on the stove that were not burned but were, he would say diplomatically, enthusiastically cooked. She was sitting at the table with his accounts ledger open and a piece of paper beside it where she had been making notes. She looked up. "I found a second discrepancy," she said. "From Henderson 6 months ago, $4. He poured himself coffee, sat down, looked at her notes. "You were up early," he said. "I'm always up early." "So am I." "I know, I heard you." She looked back at the ledger. "I'll go see Henderson this week." "He's not a bad man," Wade said. "Just careless." "Careless with other people's money is bad enough," she said. Not harshly, just plainly. "Eat your eggs." He ate his eggs. It was, he would think later, the most ordinary morning he had spent in years. And ordinary, he was discovering, was something he had badly underestimated. The problem arrived on the fourth day. Wade came in from his morning work to find Sophia on the porch, standing very still, looking at something on the ground at the base of the steps. He came around to see what it was. A dead crow, laid deliberately, not fallen, wings spread flat, placed with intention. He stood there for a moment. "Someone came in the night," he said. "Yes." He looked at the road. No tracks he could distinguish from the usual traffic. He looked at the surrounding fence line, at the pasture. Nothing visibly disturbed. "It's a message," he said. "I know what it is," she said. Her voice was flat. He looked at her face. She was angry. Not frightened, angry. And he appreciated that about her. But he also saw beneath the anger something working hard not to become fear. "He's watching," she said. "He's always been watching," Wade said. "Now he wants us to know it." He picked up the crow with a rag and disposed of it. He did not make a great deal of it. He went back inside, washed his hands, and said to her, "Don't change anything you're doing." She looked at him. "He wants a reaction," Wade said. "He wants to see if you'll flinch, or if I will. If we change our behavior, he knows it worked. And if we don't? Then he has to escalate. And when he escalates, he makes mistakes." She considered that. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about men like him," he said. "For a while now." She was quiet for a moment, then, "All right." That was it. No more discussion. She sat back down at the kitchen table with the ledger, and he went back out to finish the fence work. The crow was the first thing. The second thing happened 8 days later. Wade rode out to the south pasture for the morning check and found the gate open. It was a solid gate, well hung, with a drop latch he had installed himself 2 years ago because the original latch had been inadequate. The drop latch was up. The gate was open, and 31 cattle were gone. He stood at that gate for a long time. He was not the kind of man who raged. He had learned at some early age, not from any particular lesson, just from the accumulation of life, that rage was expensive and usually bought you nothing worth having. He stood there and breathed and let the fact of it settle into him, and then he started thinking. He rode the perimeter, found tracks heading northeast, multiple horses, moving cattle by night. The trail went toward the Curtis property, which was the parcel that Curtis had acquired from Pierce's disputed boundary. Wade recognized the irony without finding it particularly amusing. He rode back to the house. 31 head, he told Sophia. She set down her coffee. Rourke? His people, I'd guess. He won't have been there himself. What do you do? I go to the sheriff's office, he said, and I report a theft. She looked at him steadily. You know he's behind it, and you're going to report it to him. I need a paper trail. I need his signature on a report, something that shows the date, the complaint, what he said in response. He looked at her. If this goes where I want it to go, that paper becomes evidence. Sophia held his gaze. He could see her working through it. He'll deny it, she said. Of course. He might arrest you. On what charge? He'll invent one. He might. Wade said, which is why I'd like you to ride to your father's and stay there until I come back. If I'm not back by evening, send word to Pierce. She stood up. I'm not going to my father's, she said. Sophia, I'll stay here with the rifle. Someone should be on the property. She met his eyes. I can shoot. He looked at her. Can you? He said, not doubting exactly, just confirming. My father taught me when I was 12. I'm better than average. She said it without any particular pride, just as fact. Go report your cattle. I'll be here. He went. The ride into Red Creek felt different than it usually did. He was aware of being looked at. Not obviously, not rudely, but in that particular small-town way where eyes find you without people turning their heads. Word had gotten around about the wedding, about the crow on the porch, about the open gate on the south pasture. In a town this size, information moved like weather. He tied coat to the post outside the sheriff's office and went in. Rourke was behind his desk. He was a large man, not fat, but broad, with the kind of physical presence that took up more space than the body itself. Something to do with how he sat, how he held himself, like a man who had decided very early that the world owed him room. He had a face that would have been ordinary if not for his eyes, which were a pale gray that had an uncomfortably assessing quality, always slightly narrowed, always calculating. He looked up when Wade came in. Mercer, he said, in a voice that was pleasant the way a locked door is pleasant, technically inoffensive, offering nothing. Sheriff? Wade came to the desk and stood. He did not sit because he hadn't been invited to, and he wasn't going to ask. I need to report a theft. 31 head of cattle, south pasture. Gate was opened in the night. Tracks heading northeast. Rourke leaned back in his chair. His expression was composed, professionally sympathetic. That's a hard thing, he said. Cattle theft. Happens more than people think out here. I'd like to file a report. Of course. Rourke opened his desk drawer and produced a form with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times. He dipped his pen. Date of discovery? This morning, but it happened in the night. Sometime between midnight and 4, I'd estimate. And you said the tracks went northeast? Toward the Curtis property. A pause. So small most people would have missed it. Curtis, Rourke repeated, writing something. I'll look into it. I'd appreciate knowing what you find, Wade said. Rourke looked up from the form, those pale eyes resting on Wade's face with that measuring quality that probably made a lot of people uncomfortable. Wade held the look without difficulty. You know, Rourke said, setting the pen down, marriage is a big change for a man. New responsibilities. A wife. He let that sit for a moment. How's the new Mrs. Mercer settling in? Fine, Wade said. Good. Rourke smiled, a composed, careful smile. Sophia's a fine woman. Her family's been part of this community a long time. The smile stayed where it was. I'd hate to see anything disrupt that. I'd hate that too, Wade said, in the same even tone. They looked at each other. It was the kind of conversation where everything that mattered was in the part that wasn't being said, and they both knew it, and they both knew the other knew it, and neither of them was going to change that by saying it plainly. Not yet. I'll look into the cattle situation, Rourke said, and picked up his pen again. I appreciate it, Wade said. He walked out. On the street, he stood for a moment beside Coat and breathed the dry afternoon air. His hands were perfectly still at his sides. Inside, something was running very cold and very clear, the way water runs fast under ice. Rourke had not been surprised by the northeast direction. He had not asked clarifying questions about the gate latch or the number of cattle or the time of discovery. He had moved to Curtis's name like a man who had been waiting for it, and then pulled back smooth as silk. Good, Wade thought. Keep doing exactly that. He mounted and rode home. When he got back, Sophia was on the porch with the rifle across her knees, reading a book. She looked up when he rode in. Still free, he said. I can see that. She stood, leaning the rifle against the wall. How'd he take it? Like a man who already knew about it, Wade said. He mentioned you. Her jaw tightened slightly. What did he say? That you were a fine woman and he'd hate to see anything disrupt your family. He watched her face. Standard intimidation, reminding me what he has access to. She was quiet for a moment. My father's payments, she said. I talked to him. And? He'll do it. She said it steadily, but he could hear the weight in it, what it had cost Ernesto to agree, the pride it required him to set aside. He wasn't easy to convince. He thinks cooperating with any official process means admitting something shameful. I told him that what's shameful isn't the pain, it's the man who made him pay. Wade nodded slowly. That's right, he said. He's kept the records in a box under the counter for 4 years. Every amount, every date, a description of which deputy came to collect and what was said. She paused. My father is, if nothing else, meticulous. 4 years of documented payments, Wade said, and felt something shift in the calculation he'd been carrying. He also told me something I didn't know, Sophia said. Samuel Voss, the miller on the North Road, he paid for 2 years and then stopped. Last spring. I know about Voss. You know Rourke threatened him with the fire inspection. I know that. Did you know, Sophia said, that the night after Voss refused, someone broke into his mill and damaged the main grindstone? He spent 3 weeks repairing it. He never reported it because he knew who it was, and he knew reporting it would only bring more, Wade said. Yes. He looked out at the pasture. The cattle that remained, the 23 he hadn't lost, were moving slowly toward the water trough in the late afternoon light. I need to talk to Voss, he said. I thought you might, Sophia said. I sent a message to him this morning. He'll come here on Thursday. Wade looked at her. You sent a message, he said. I didn't think you'd object. I don't. He looked at her for another moment. Thank you. She picked up her book. Don't thank me yet. He might say no. But Voss didn't say no. He came on Thursday, a lean, angular man with flour dust permanently embedded in the lines of his hands, and he sat at Wade's kitchen table with his hat in his lap and said, in a voice that seemed to have been waiting a long time to say something, that he was tired of being afraid. I'm not a brave man, Voss said. I want to be clear about that. I'm just tired. There's a point where being tired gets bigger than being afraid, and I think I've gotten there. That's all bravery usually is, Wade said, being tired enough to stop running. Voss looked at him. Then he looked at Sophia, who had made coffee and was sitting on the other side of the table, with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything, focused, unobtrusive, missing nothing. What do you need from me? Voss asked. Your account of what happened, Wade said, written and signed. Dates, descriptions of the damage, what was said to you beforehand, what you understood the threat to be. He paused, and a willingness to say it in person, if it comes to that. In person to who? A judge, Wade said. Not Harmon. Then who? A man named Ambrose. He was circuit judge through this district for 15 years. He knows this county. He knows what's in it. Wade kept his voice level. He's retired, but he's not dead, and he responded to my letter. Voss sat with that for a moment. If Rourke finds out I'm cooperating, he'll find out eventually, Wade said. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. I'm not going to make this sound safer than it is. He appreciated Wade's honesty, or at least that was how it looked on his face. A man who had been lied to or handled carefully too many times and found plain truth, even hard truth, something like a relief. All right, Voss said. I'll write it down. I'll come to wherever you need me. After Voss left, Pierce came by the following evening with the 2 additional men he had mentioned. A farmer named Holland who had lost his water rights in a disputed county ruling 18 months ago, and a rancher named Dietz who had been paying Rourke's informal tax for 3 years. Both of them sat in Wade's parlor, and both of them had the same quality Voss had, the quality of men who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and were finally looking for somewhere to set it down. Wade sat with them for 2 hours. He listened more than he talked. He wrote down what they told him, and he was careful and specific and patient, and when they left, his journal had 23 new pages. 11 days after the wedding, someone burned the section of fence along Wade's north pasture line. They did it at night. He woke to the smell of smoke and got there in time to keep it from spreading to the dry grass beyond, but 40 feet of good fencing was gone, and 2 posts that had taken him a week to set were ash. He stood there in the early morning light with a bucket in his hand looking at the damage and felt the cold anger run through him like a current. Behind him, Sophia appeared. She had come without being called. She stood beside him, looked at the burned fence, and said nothing for a moment. He's getting louder, she said at last. Yes. That means he's getting worried. That's one reading, Wade said. What's the other? That he's done calculating and he's moving to force the issue. He set the bucket down. Either way, it moves the timeline. She looked at him. How close are you? He thought about the journal. 23 new pages. Voss's written account. Holland's and Dietz's. Pierce's survey copies. Ernesto's 4 years of payment records, which Sophia had brought over in a neat box 2 days ago and which he had spent an evening reading with a mounting and very cold fury. Close enough, he said. Not as close as I'd like. What else do you need? He looked at the burned fence, looked at the pasture beyond it, where the remaining cattle were moving in the morning light, indifferent to the drama around them in the practical way of cattle. Rourke is going to make a move, he said. Something official, something that lets him use the badge. He'll try to charge me with something. The missing cattle is probably the setup. He'll claim I'm the thief, not the victim. Sophia's face changed slightly. He'll use his own crime to accuse you of it, she said. That's how it works. He controls the paperwork, the deputies, the county records. He can build a case out of paper and proximity. He turned to face her directly. When that happens, and it will happen, probably soon, that's when I move. That's when all of this goes public. You want him to make the accusation, she said. I want him to overcommit, he said. I want him in front of the town with his accusation and his evidence and his authority, and then I want to pull out the floor from under him. She was quiet for a long moment. That's a very narrow window, she said. I know. If something goes wrong, things will go wrong, he said simply. Something always does. The question is whether we've built something solid enough that the things going wrong don't bring down what matters. She looked at him. In the early morning light, with smoke still drifting off the burned fence line and the day's work not yet started, she looked at him the way you look at someone when you are deciding how much to trust them. Not whether, how much. Write to Ambrose again, she said. Tell him we need him here sooner than we planned. I was going to. Tell him it needs to be soon, she said, and tell him to come quietly. She turned and walked back toward the house to start breakfast. He watched her go, this woman who 3 weeks ago had been a familiar stranger and was now, in all the ways that practically mattered, his partner in something that could go very badly wrong. He looked back at the burned fence. He thought about what needed doing, and he began making a list in his head, the way he always made his lists, methodically, without panic, starting with the most urgent and working down. Rebuild the fence. Ride to Pierce and tell him to keep his men alert at night. Write to Ambrose. Check the south pasture gate before dark every evening. Find a way to warn Voss and Holland and Dietz without making them more afraid than they already were. And wait, because Rourke was going to come, and the only advantage Wade had was that he had been building quietly for a long time, and Rourke did not know how much he had built. He picked up the bucket and went to get the tools. The fence wasn't going to rebuild itself, and the work, as it always did, was waiting. Ambrose wrote back in 9 days. Wade read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then handed it to Sophia without comment. She read it standing up, the way she read most things, and when she was done, she set it on the table and looked at him. He's coming, she said, 3 weeks from Thursday. That's cutting it close. It's what we have. Wade folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his work jacket, where he kept the things that mattered. He said he'd arrive quietly, said he knows people in the county he trusts to arrange lodging that won't draw attention. Does he understand what he's walking into? I told him enough. Wade picked up his coffee. He's a careful man. He'll understand more when he gets here. Sophia was quiet for a moment, looking at the window. The morning light was coming in sideways and thin, the way it did in that season, and it caught the side of her face and showed the tiredness she had been carrying for the past 2 weeks without making much of it. Rourke hasn't moved yet, she said. No. That worries me more than when he was burning fences. He's building something, Wade said. When men like him go quiet, it's not because they've given up. It's because they're arranging. He was right, and he knew he was right, and the knowing of it sat in his chest like a stone he carried around and tried not to think about too directly. Rourke had gone quiet 9 days ago. No more dead birds, no burned property, no deputies making slow passes on the road near the ranch. That silence had a texture to it, a held breath quality. 2 days after the letter from Ambrose, Hector Flass came to the ranch. Wade saw him coming from the pasture, the deputy's gray horse distinctive at a distance, that particular lazy, loping trot Flass always rode at, like a man who was in no hurry because the badge gave him all the time he needed. Wade came in from the east fence and met him at the gate. Flass was 26, maybe 27. Not a bad young man fundamentally, Wade had always thought. Just weak in the specific way that made weak men dangerous, which was that he had attached himself to someone strong and borrowed that strength without examining what it cost. He had a round, youngish face that tried to look harder than it was. "Mr. Mercer," he said from the saddle. "Deputy, Sheriff asked me to bring you something." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded paper. "Official notice." Wade took it, unfolded it, read it once, slowly. It was a notice of investigation. Wade Mercer was hereby informed that the Red Creek County Sheriff's Office was conducting an investigation into suspected cattle theft in the county, and that Wade Mercer's property and records might be subject to inspection in connection with that investigation. He read it a second time. "He's accusing me," Wade said. "Flat. Not a question." "It's just a notice of investigation," Flass said with the slightly rehearsed quality of someone repeating what they'd been told to say. "Doesn't mean any charges, just means you're part of the inquiry." "Into cattle theft?" "Yes, sir. My cattle were stolen." "That's..." "The sheriff is looking into all aspects of the situation." Wade looked up from the paper at Flass. The young deputy met his gaze for about 3 seconds before finding something interesting to look at somewhere past Wade's left shoulder. "Hector?" Wade said. "Sir?" "How long have you been working for Rourke?" A pause. "Going on 2 years. You grow up around here?" "Millfield, about 40 miles north." "Your family's still there?" Flass looked slightly confused by the direction. "My mother and my younger brother, yes." "Good people?" "Yes, sir. I'd say so." Wade nodded slowly, looking at the notice in his hand. "You tell the sheriff I received this," he said, "and I'll be looking forward to discussing it with him directly." Flass nodded, pulled his horse around, and rode back down the road. Wade watched him go and then stood at the gate for a moment in the thin morning air. So Rourke was building a case. Wade was the cattle thief. That was the shape of it. Rourke's men had taken his cattle, probably moved them to Curtis's property or somewhere else with cooperative management, and now the sheriff would produce them as evidence. Evidence that Wade Mercer had been hiding stolen cattle. The report Wade had filed would be reframed. Not a victim's report, but a preemptive attempt to establish an alibi. It was a workable frame. Not airtight, but in a county where Rourke controlled the law, airtight wasn't necessary. He went inside and showed Sophia the notice. She read it without a word. When she finished, she set it on the table with a precision that suggested she was controlling something. "He's ready to move," she said. "Soon, I think. Within a week." She looked at him. "We're not ready." "No," he said. "We're not quite. Ambrose isn't here yet." "No." She sat down. He watched her think. That quality she had of visible but internal processing, working through a problem with the same methodical care she applied to the accounts ledger. "We need to accelerate," she said. "I know." "The witnesses, Pierce, Voss, Holland, Dietz. They need to know the timeline has moved. I'll ride to each of them today. And my father." She looked up at him. "His records. I need to get them from the store and bring them here." "Do it today. Don't wait." He paused. "Sophia, if Rourke moves before Ambrose gets here, then we use what we have," she said. "We don't wait for perfect." He looked at her. "No," he agreed. "We don't." He spent that day on horseback, riding a long loop that took him to Pierce's property, then Voss's mill, then Holland's farm, and Dietz's operation. He told each of them the same thing plainly. Rourke was moving. The timeline was compressed. He needed them to be ready to act quickly when he sent word, and he needed each of them to be sure, because once this started, there was no comfortable way to step back from it. Each of them, in their own way, said yes. Pierce with the quiet stubbornness of a man who had lost land and wanted it back. Voss with the exhausted determination he'd shown at the kitchen table. Holland with a nervous energy that might have been fear or might have been something closer to relief at finally doing something. Dietz with almost no expression at all, just a single nod that had the weight of a decision made long before this conversation. None of them were brave in the storybook sense. They were just people who had run out of better options, which was its own kind of courage. When Wade got home that evening, Sophia had her father's box on the kitchen table and was going through it. She had organized the contents into 3 stacks: dates on the left, amounts in the middle, deputy names and descriptions on the right. Her handwriting was small and precise, and she had made a summary sheet on top that condensed 4 years of extortion into a single, clean document. She looked up when he came in. 47 payments, she said. Not counting 2 months where he missed and Rourke sent someone to make the point clear. She set her pen down. $1,140 over 4 years, from one merchant in one small town. He hung his jacket and sat down. "How is your father?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "He cried," she said. "When I told him the full timeline, how close things are." She looked at her hands. "Not because he was afraid. I think he was angry, and the anger had nowhere to go, so it came out the other way." She straightened the stack of papers. "He said to tell you he'll testify himself if it comes to that." "I hope it doesn't have to come to that." "He wants it to," she said, and there was something in her voice, pride maybe, and something more complicated under it. "He's been paying that man for 4 years. He wants to say it out loud in front of people." Wade nodded. "He'll get the chance," he said. 3 days passed, then 4. Each one had the particular texture of waiting, that specific quality of time that moves both too slowly and too fast, where ordinary things feel slightly unreal because you know something is coming and you don't know exactly when. On the 5th day, Sophia found Wade's journal. Not by accident. He had left it on the kitchen table when he went out that morning, having spent the previous night adding the most recent entries, and he had forgotten to put it back before he started the morning work. She found it when she came down for coffee. She didn't read it. She could see from the cover that it was private. But she held it when he came back in, and she held it with a kind of weight, as if she was feeling through the cover how much was inside. "Is this everything?" she said. "Everything I have," he said. She handed it back. "Can I read it?" He thought about that for a moment. He had kept it alone for 4 months. The content of it was not personal. It wasn't a diary, just dates and names and observations. But there was something about it that felt private in the way that things you've built alone feel private. "Yes," he said. She read it that afternoon while he was doing the pasture check. When he came back, she was at the table with the journal closed in front of her and a look on her face that was hard to read. "You saw Rourke's Deputy Flass take money from the Tatum Saloon on a Tuesday in September," she said. "I was passing. I saw it through the window. You noted that Curtis's property showed new fencing within 6 weeks of Pierce losing his grazing boundary, consistent with the cattle needing new enclosure." "Yes." "And you wrote down that 2 years ago, the County Water Board changed their meeting schedule with 2 days' notice, on the same week that Holland's water rights case was being heard, so Holland missed the hearing." She looked up at him. "That's not coincidence." "No," he said. She was quiet. "Wade," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name without the slight formality that had been between them at the start. It came out natural, unguarded, like she hadn't planned it. There's a lot here." "It's 4 months of watching carefully," he said. "It's more than that. She stopped, seemed to be looking for the word. "It's a case. A real one. This plus my father's records, plus what the others can testify." "It's enough for Ambrose," he said, "if he's the man I believe he is." She looked at the journal. "When does he arrive?" "Thursday. 8 days." She nodded slowly. Rourke came for Wade on Tuesday. It was mid-morning. Wade was on the porch replacing a board that had gone soft when he saw the dust on the road. 3 horses, moving at a deliberate pace. He set his hammer down and watched them come. He knew before they arrived. Rourke rode in front, Flass to his left. A 3rd deputy named Cole, a quiet man who was broad across the shoulders and had the specific look of a man hired for physicality, on the right. Sophia appeared at the front door. Wade didn't turn to look at her, but he heard the door and knew she was there. Rourke reined his horse at the gate. He was in his good clothes, the ones he wore when he wanted to look official. His badge caught the morning light. "Mercer," he said, "we need you to come with us." What's the charge? Wade said. His voice came out even. Not friendly, not aggressive, just level. Cattle theft, Rourke said. We found your brand on cattle in the possession of 3 different parties in the county. Animals that those parties report acquiring through questionable means, tracing back to your operation. It was elegant, Wade had to admit. As a lie, it was elegant. His brand on cattle that Rourke's people had taken from his south pasture, now redistributed and producing witness statements that pointed back at Wade. 3 weeks of quiet preparation had produced something that looked, on its face, like evidence. That's not what happened, Wade said. I'm not asking what happened. I'm telling you you're under investigation and you need to come in. Under arrest? Rourke's jaw tightened slightly. Under investigation. I'm asking you to come voluntarily. And if I don't? Then I ask less politely. From the doorway, Sophia said, clearly and calmly, He'll come. Give us 5 minutes. Rourke looked at her. Something moved in his face. A complicated thing that he controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough. 5 minutes, he said. Wade went inside. Sophia followed and closed the door. They stood in the kitchen. She was already moving. She crossed to the cabinet, opened the second drawer, and pulled out a sealed envelope he hadn't seen before. What is that? He said. I wrote to Ambrose 4 days ago, she said. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to argue about it. I told him we needed him in 6 days, not 8, and I explained why. She held the envelope out. He replied yesterday. He's already here. Arrived in Millfield 2 days ago. He's staying with a schoolteacher named Claire Hawes, who is apparently an old acquaintance. Wade stared at her. You wrote to him without telling me, he said. I knew Rourke was moving, and I knew you were going to want to handle it yourself and wait for the right moment. She held the envelope steadily. I wasn't going to wait for the right moment. I was going to make one. He took the envelope, read the letter inside. Ambrose confirmed he was in Millfield. He confirmed he would be in Red Creek when needed. He said he had reviewed what Wade had sent him and found it credible, and that he would need the witnesses assembled. The witnesses, Wade said. I sent word to Pierce this morning, Sophia said. He's contacting the others. Sophia, Wade. She met his eyes directly. You built the foundation. I'm not dismissing that. But you were going to let Rourke take you into that office and put you behind bars while you waited for the perfect timing, and there is no perfect timing. She paused. Go with them. Don't resist. Let him make the arrest official. That's the paperwork we need, his official accusation, because that's what Ambrose needs to overturn. He looked at her for a long moment. You thought this through, he said. While you were doing the pasture check yesterday. He exhaled slowly. What do you need from me? He said. Tell me where the journal is. Under the loose board, bedroom, southeast corner. She nodded. And the primary copies of everything? Same place, wrapped in oilcloth. She looked at him steadily. I'll get them to Ambrose. Pierce will bring the others. You get Rourke to make it official and documented, and you stay steady in there. How long? He said. 1 day, she said. Maybe 2. And if something goes wrong on your end? She was quiet for a moment. Then, it won't. He looked at her. He wanted to say something that would convey what he was thinking, which was that this woman he had known for 6 weeks had just done in 4 days what he had been too stubborn to ask for help with in 4 months, and that he was not entirely sure what to do with that. He said, Be careful. You too, she said. He walked out the door and got on his horse and rode into Red Creek between 2 deputies and a corrupt sheriff, and he kept his hands loose on the reins and his face still and his mind working. The cell at the back of the Red Creek Sheriff's office had 2 bunks and no window, and smelled of old straw and something unpleasant underneath it. Rourke had him processed with the careful efficiency of a man who understood the value of paperwork, the charge written, witnessed, dated, filed. Wade watched all of this and made a point of reading everything he was shown and noting the specifics. He didn't argue. He didn't protest beyond necessary denials of the charge itself. Rourke came to the cell door after the processing was done. You want to tell me where the cattle went? Rourke said. I reported them stolen to your office 3 weeks ago, Wade said. You filed the report. I filed a report that you made. Doesn't mean I believe it. I understand. Rourke stood at the door with his hands in his pockets, studying Wade with those pale eyes. He seemed vaguely unsatisfied by Wade's composure, the way a man is unsatisfied when he lands a punch and the other person doesn't go down. "Your wife's going to have a hard time managing that ranch on her own," Rourke said. "My wife," Wade said, "is capable of managing considerably more than that." Rourke's expression shifted slightly. Not much, but enough for Wade to know that Sophia's capability was something Rourke had perhaps miscalculated. "I'll get you out of here in a day or two," Rourke said. "Once the investigation's run its course, things should become clear." "I imagine they will," Wade said. Rourke left. Wade sat on the thin bunk in the small cell and breathed the stale air and told himself to be patient. Patience was something he had in quantity. 11 years of it, at least. He sat with his back against the wall and kept his mind steady and thought about what Sophia was doing at this moment, who she was talking to, what she was moving. He thought about Ambrose and Millfield, already here, already waiting. He thought about Pierce and Voss and Holland and Dietz, each of them carrying the particular weight of a decision made, moving toward the moment when they'd have to stand behind it. He thought about Ernesto Navarro's box, 47 payments in precise handwriting, 4 years of a proud man's humiliation converted into something that might, if they were careful and fortunate and reasonably smart about it, mean something. Flass came by at noon with a plate of food. He set it on the floor in front of the cell door and didn't quite meet Wade's eyes. "Hector," Wade said. The deputy looked up. "That thing you're helping him build," Wade said quietly. "The case he's putting together against me. You know it isn't true." Flass said nothing. "You know where those cattle actually came from. You know the fence on my north pasture didn't burn itself." He paused. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm just saying you know." Flass picked up his hat, which he'd been turning in his hands. "I just work here," he said. "So did every man who ever looked the other way for someone bad," Wade said, without heat. "That's usually how it works." Flass left without another word. Wade ate the food, which was bad, but not inedible, and went back to waiting. It was late afternoon when he heard it, the sound of voices outside, more than would normally cluster near the jail, a kind of building murmur, the low atmospheric pressure of something gathering. He stood on the bunk and looked through the single gap in the wall near the ceiling, not a window, just an air gap, and through it he could see a sliver of the street. People were congregating near the center of town. He could see backs, hat brims, the slow accumulation of a crowd. Something was happening. His jaw tightened. In the front of the office, he heard Rourke's chair scrape back, heard him say something sharp to Flass, heard the front door open. Wade got down from the bunk and sat. He had built what he could build. He had done what he could do. The rest of it was in other people's hands now, which was not a thing that came naturally to a man who had been doing everything alone for 11 years. He felt the urge to pace and resisted it. He sat with his hands on his knees and breathed and listened to the sounds of the town building towards something outside these walls. Sophia had said one day, maybe two. He looked at the ceiling of the cell, looked at the single gap of light. He could wait. The murmur outside built slowly, the way weather builds. Not all at once, but in accumulation, pressure finding pressure until the thing had weight. Wade heard it from the cell. He couldn't see much through the air gap, just that sliver of street and hat brims and the sense of bodies gathering, but he could hear the tone of it changing. It had started as a low curiosity, people drawn towards something without quite knowing what, and it was becoming something else, more deliberate, more charged. He heard Rourke cross the front office in 3 long strides, heard him say to Flass sharply, "What in hell is going on out there?" It wasn't a question. Flass said something too low to make out. Then the front door opened and closed, and Wade was alone in the back of the office with the sound of the town filtering through the wall. What was going on out there had started approximately 4 hours earlier, in the back room of Navarro's Mercantile. Sophia had gone straight from the ranch to her father's store after Rourke took Wade away. She had moved fast and without wasted motion, pulled the oilcloth package from under the bedroom floorboard exactly where Wade said it would be, taken the journal, taken the summary documents she had prepared from Ernesto's payment records, and ridden hard into Red Creek. She arrived at the Mercantile before noon and went in through the back. Ernesto was behind the counter when she came in. He took one look at her face. "He took him," Ernesto said. "This morning, 3 of them." Her father's expression did something she had not seen on it in years. a particular compression of the jaw, a stillness that was not calm but was the thing just before action. He untied his apron. "What do you need?" he said. "I need the wagon, and I need you to send the Halverson boy to get Pierce." "Already?" "Already." Ernesto was moving before she finished the sentence. Sophia sent 3 messages in the next 2 hours, one to Pierce via the Halverson boy, one to Samuel Voss at the mill via a rider she hired for 50 cents, and one to a woman named Claire Hawes in Millfield that said only, "He is in custody. Today, if possible. SM." Then she sat in the back room of her father's store and organized everything one more time, laying it out on the work table with the same systematic precision she brought to the accounts. The journal went first, Wade's 4 months of dated observations, each entry in his plain, unhurried handwriting. Then Ernesto's payment records, her summary sheet on top. Then the copies of Pierce's original survey documents that disputed the boundary change. Then Voss's written account of the damaged millstone, signed and dated. Holland's water rights documentation. Dietz's record of payments, less organized than her father's, but no less real. She looked at it all spread across the table. It was, she thought, enough. It had to be. Pierce arrived an hour later, still dusty from the ride. Voss came 20 minutes after that, and then Holland and Dietz together, having apparently run into each other on the road coming in. They stood in the back room of Navarro's Mercantile and looked at the table and at Sophia, who stood at the head of it. "Rourke arrested my husband this morning on a fabricated cattle theft charge," she said. "He's in the jail now. The charge is built on cattle that Rourke's own people took from our south pasture and redistributed to look like evidence." She paused. "This is the moment we planned for. I know that's frightening. I know some of you are calculating right now what this costs you. I'm not going to tell you there's no cost." Nobody said anything. "But I'll tell you this," she continued. "Rourke arrested my husband because he's afraid. Men who aren't afraid don't arrest people. They don't burn fences. They don't move boundary markers in the night and falsify county records. They don't take money from shopkeepers for 4 years." She let that settle. "He's afraid because of what's in this room right now, because of what each of you put your name on." Pierce looked at the table. Then he looked up. "What do you need us to do?" "I need you to be willing to stand in the street and say what you know. Not in a courtroom. Not yet. In the street, in front of the town, where Rourke can't control who's listening." She looked at each of them in turn. "And I need Judge Ambrose to be there when you do." "The judge is in Millfield," Voss said. "He was," Sophia said. "He may not be anymore." She was right. Ambrose arrived in Red Creek at 2:30 in the afternoon in a plain buckboard driven by Claire Hawes, who was a compact, gray-haired woman with the no-nonsense bearing of someone who had taught school for 30 years and found most things in life less alarming than a room full of 8-year-olds. Ambrose himself was 71, which was older than Wade had expected from the letters. A lean, dry-looking man with white hair and careful eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a plain brown suit that gave no indication of his former office. He looked like someone's grandfather on a visiting trip. He looked like nobody important. That was, Sophia understood immediately, entirely intentional. She met them at the livery on the south end of Main Street, away from the foot traffic. Ambrose got down from the buckboard with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints had opinions about Texas weather, and he shook her hand with a firm, dry grip. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "your letter was persuasive." "My husband's journal is more so," she said. "I have it here." She had it in a leather satchel. She gave it to him right there, along with the summary documents, and he stood in the livery doorway and read with the focused efficiency of a man who had spent 40 years distilling complex situations into essential facts. He asked 2 questions. Both were specific, and both showed he had already understood the larger shape of things from Wade's earlier letters. "The witnesses are assembled," he said, "in my father's store. 5 of them, with documentation. Your husband is in Rourke's jail." "Yes." He looked at the journal for a moment longer. Then he closed it and handed it back to her. "Here's what I can do," he said in the plain tone of a man describing a practical problem. "I have no active judicial authority in this county. My jurisdiction ended with my retirement. What I have is standing, personal standing, professional reputation, and the ability to compel attention from people who still serve in an active capacity. He looked at her steadily. What I can do today is be present as a witness of credibility while the facts are presented publicly. What happens after that? The formal proceedings, the arrest, the official record that requires someone with current authority. You said in your letter you knew the territorial marshal, Sophia said. I do. He owes me a professional debt that he has never had occasion to repay. Ambrose's expression was entirely dry. I believe today is the occasion. He had, she would learn later, sent a telegraph from Millfield 2 days ago. The territorial marshal's office was already aware that something was developing in Red Creek County. Sophia looked at this old man in his plain suit and thought about the 11 years Wade had spent building something alone and patient on that ranch. And she thought about her own 6 weeks of watching and calculating and moving quietly. And she thought that sometimes the most important things in a place were the things that didn't announce themselves. All right, she said, then let's go. What happened next in Red Creek was not organized in any dramatic or theatrical sense. It assembled itself the way a storm assembles, from available conditions, from pressure that had been building in the atmosphere of that town for years, finding its moment and its form. Sophia brought Ambrose to the back room of the Mercantile and introduced him to the witnesses. He spoke to each of them briefly, asking questions in that quiet, precise way that made people feel heard rather than interrogated. He looked at the documents. He made 3 notes in a small leather notebook he kept in his breast pocket. Ernesto Navarro sat at the end of the table through all of this. He had not said much since Sophia arrived. He was a man who expressed things through movement and action rather than words, and the stillness he was holding right now was a particular kind, the stillness of a man who has finally stopped running from something and is now facing it directly and finding that it is, if not smaller than he feared, at least more survivable. When Ambrose finished his review, he looked at Ernesto. Mr. Navarro, he said, your records are the most complete documentation of a pattern of extortion I have seen outside of a formally prosecuted case. I want you to understand what that means. Ernesto looked at him. It means, Ambrose said, that your fear was reasonable, that your choices were made under real duress, and that what you've kept in that box is not evidence of your shame, it's evidence of his crime. He paused. I want you to know that before we go out there. Ernesto was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. My wife, he said, always said that a record is the only honest thing. That paper doesn't lie the way people do. He cleared his throat. She kept every receipt from the first day we opened, every invoice, every payment in and out. She said if you keep honest records, you can always prove what's true. Nobody said anything. She would have told him to go to hell 4 years ago, Ernesto said, and his voice went slightly rough on the last part, and then he straightened up and looked at Ambrose. So let's go do that now. It began quietly. Sophia was the one who walked out into Main Street first, with the leather satchel and the composure of a woman who had made her calculation and was living in it. Pierce came out next, then Voss, then Holland and Dietz together, then Ernesto, then Ambrose and Claire Hawes, who had decided without being asked that she was staying. They positioned themselves in the center of the street, near the water trough that served as the informal center point of Red Creek's main stretch. People noticed. People always notice when a group assembles with purpose in a small town. It has a different quality from casual congregation, a different gravity. Heads turned. A woman who had been sweeping her porch stopped sweeping. The blacksmith came to his doorway. 2 men outside the saloon straightened up. Sophia spoke first. She did not shout. She spoke in a carrying voice, clear and level, the voice of a woman who had spent years keeping accounts and knew that precision mattered. My husband was arrested this morning on a charge of cattle theft, she said. The cattle were taken from our property 3 weeks ago by people acting under Sheriff Rourke's direction. I have documentation of this. I have witnesses. And I have evidence that the pattern of corruption that produced this false arrest is not new and is not limited to my family. She paused. The street was paying attention. I'm asking the people of Red Creek to listen, she said, because what's in this documentation affects most of you, whether you know it or not. Pierce stepped forward then, without any particular drama, just a rancher moving to stand next to a woman in the street, and he said in his broad, flat voice, My name is Daniel Pierce. My east pasture boundary was falsified in county records 2 years ago. I have the original survey to prove it. I lost 20 acres of grazing land and never got justice because the man responsible carries a badge. He stepped back. Voss moved forward. Samuel Voss, Miller on the North Road. I paid Sheriff Rourke's informal tax for 2 years. When I stopped, my mill was vandalized. I have a written account. He held up the document. I never reported it because I was afraid. I'm not reporting it now. I'm saying it out loud where people can hear it. Holland. Dietz. Each of them in turn, each account plain and specific and free of theater, the accumulating weight of ordinary people saying ordinary true things in a public place. It was not dramatic in the way that drama is supposed to look. It was quiet and steady and relentless, the way water is relentless, and the crowd that had gathered, 20 people now, 30, was very still in the way people go still when they are hearing something they already suspected and are finally being given permission to believe. Rourke appeared at the edge of the crowd. He had come from the direction of the jail, and he had Cole with him, and his face had the particular expression of a man who has walked into a situation he did not prepare for and is moving quickly to control it. He came through the edge of the gathering crowd with the practiced authority of a man who had been using that authority for years without it failing him. "All right," he said, loud, cutting across the noise. "That's enough. This is an unlawful assembly, and these are slanderous statements about an officer of the law. Sheriff Rourke." The voice came from Ambrose, who had moved to the front of the group while Rourke was pushing through the crowd, and who now stood in the street with his hands clasped in front of him in no particular aggressive posture, just standing there in his plain brown suit, looking at Rourke with those careful eyes. Rourke stopped. He looked at Ambrose. Something in his face changed, very subtle, a slight recalculation behind the pale eyes. A man trying to place a face and finding the placing uncomfortable. "I don't believe we've met," Rourke said, carefully. "My name is Edmund Ambrose," the old man said. "I served as circuit judge in this district for 15 years. I retired 3 years ago." He paused. "I am here at the invitation of several of your constituents who felt that the formal channels of complaint available to them had been compromised." The crowd had gone very quiet. Rourke looked at Ambrose. His jaw was set. "A retired judge has no authority in this county," he said. "That's correct," Ambrose said pleasantly. "Which is why I contacted the Territorial Marshal's office 2 days ago, and why I expect you'll be receiving a visit from them within the next 48 hours. He tilted his head slightly. "I should also tell you that the documentation I have reviewed this afternoon, which includes 4 years of payment records, falsified land surveys, witness accounts of property destruction, and a detailed observational journal compiled by Mr. Wade Mercer, is, in my professional assessment, sufficient to support charges of extortion, abuse of office, property destruction, and obstruction of justice. Among other things." Rourke said nothing. His face was controlled, but something behind it was moving fast. "I would strongly suggest," Ambrose continued in the same pleasant and entirely merciless voice, "that you release Mr. Mercer from custody immediately. Holding him at this point would constitute an additional charge." He paused. "And I think you have enough." The crowd was 35, 40 people now, more drifting in from the side streets. Del Saunders, who had said in the general store that a man who picked a fight with the sheriff paid a cost, he was there, standing near the back, and his face had the particular look of a man updating his understanding of a situation. Martha Greer from the laundry, Thomas Aldridge, the barber, people who had nodded at Wade on the street for years and filed him away as honest and kept their distance from what honesty sometimes cost. Rourke looked at the crowd. He was doing what men in his position always do when power shifts. He was reading faces, looking for the ones that would still hold, looking for a path through. And what he found in the faces of the people of Red Creek was the specific expression of people who have been afraid for a long time and have just now noticed that they are not the only one. Fear, it turned out, was the same as cattle. It ran in the direction everyone else was running. "This is not over," Rourke said. He said it to Ambrose, but he was looking at Sophia. "I believe it is," Ambrose said. Rourke turned and walked back toward the jail. Cole, the broad deputy, stood for a moment looking at the crowd, looking at his employers retreating back, making some calculation of his own. Then he turned and followed Rourke, and his face when he walked away had the look of a man who knew he had just been on the wrong side of something. Sophia followed them both. She walked through the crowd, which parted for her without any particular ceremony, and she came to the sheriff's office and pushed the door open. Rourke was behind his desk, and for a moment she thought he was going to make something of it. She saw it pass through him, the impulse, the last calculation. But something in the way she stood in the doorway seemed to settle the matter. "My husband," she said. Just that. Rourke pulled the cell keys from the hook on the wall and went to the back without a word. She heard the cell door open. She heard Wade's voice. One word, low, something she couldn't make out. Then footsteps. Wade came through the back door and into the front office. He looked at her. He looked at Rourke, who was standing with the keys still in his hand with the expression of a man who has just lost something large and is not yet fully sure of its dimensions. Then Wade looked at Sophia again, and something moved through his face that she would not entirely be able to describe later. Relief and anger and something else. Something she had not seen on him before, which was the look of a man who had been carrying a thing alone for a very long time and has just had someone come alongside and help him carry it. "You move fast," he said. "You built the foundation," she said. Don't say you just anything," he said. "You didn't just anything." She almost smiled. Not quite. "Ambrose is outside," she said. "I know. I can hear him." They walked out of the sheriff's office together, into the afternoon light, and the crowd was still there, more of it now, and there was a low sound from it when Wade appeared. Not a cheer exactly, more an exhalation, the sound a room makes when a tension breaks. Ambrose came to meet them. He shook Wade's hand with that firm, dry grip. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "your journal is thorough work. My wife brought it to you," Wade said. She did. Ambrose glanced at Sophia briefly, with something in his expression that was not quite a smile but was in that neighborhood. She was persuasive in her correspondence. "She tends to be," Wade said. From somewhere in the crowd, Ernesto Navarro made his way through to his daughter, and she turned and went to him, and he put both his hands on her shoulders and looked at her face for a moment with the look of a man who is not going to say what he is feeling because he can't find words big enough. Then he pulled her into a hug that had 4 years of weight in it, and she let it land. Wade stood and watched this, and he felt the cold thing that had been living in his chest since Tuesday morning, since Rourke's 3 horses coming up the road, begin to loosen. It was not finished. He knew that. Ambrose had been clear about what his presence could and couldn't do. The formal process would take time. The territorial marshal, the official charges, the transfer of authority, Rourke's replacement. There was paperwork and procedure and probably months of uncomfortable work ahead before any of it was truly resolved. And there were still 31 of his cattle somewhere on this county. He thought about that and almost smiled. Pierce materialized at his elbow. The man had the comfortable solidity of someone who had just set down something heavy. "You're going to want to know," Pierce said, "that those cattle of yours are in Curtis's North Pen. I saw them 2 days ago, but I didn't—" He stopped. "I should have told you sooner." "You're telling me now," Wade said. "I was afraid for a long time," Pierce said. "It came out straight, without apology, but without pride either. Just an honest accounting." "Most people were," Wade said. "Being afraid of a man like Rourke is not a character flaw. It's a reasonable response." He paused. "Not coming forward eventually. That's the part that costs you." Pierce nodded. He looked at the sheriff's office. "What happens to him now?" "He stays on paper until the marshal gets here. Ambrose will make sure he can't destroy any records." Wade looked toward the office. Through the window he could see Rourke's shape behind the desk, still and contained in the particular way of a man who is recalculating his options and finding them fewer than he expected. "He'll lawyer up. It'll take time. But it'll happen." "It'll happen," Wade said. The crowd was beginning to break apart slowly, the way crowds do when the thing they came to see has reached its inflection point. Not an ending exactly, but a turn, a pivot, after which the situation is recognizably different from what it was before. People were talking, some of them to each other, some of them to the witnesses who had spoken in the street, some of them with the slightly stunned quality of people processing a thing they had suspected for years and are now having confirmed. Mrs. Greer from the laundry stopped Wade on the street. She was a stout woman in her 60s with a direct manner and no particular interest in softening things. "I want you to know," she said, "that I always thought Rourke was a bad piece of work. I want you to know I thought that." "I appreciate it," Wade said. "I didn't do anything about it," she said. I want you to know that too. I thought it and I did nothing, and people I know were being squeezed, and I told myself it wasn't my business. She held his gaze with the stubbornness of a woman being honest about something she wasn't proud of. I'm not going to pretend that was all right. It wasn't all right, Wade said, but you're here now. She nodded, crisply, like a woman closing an account. You need your laundry done, she said. You bring it to me, no charge, for a year. He almost laughed. It was so specific and so Mrs. Greer. I'll tell Sophia, he said. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the late afternoon was bringing its long amber light over the street, Wade found Ambrose sitting on the bench outside the Mercantile with a cup of coffee from inside and his notebook open on his knee. Judge, Wade said, Mr. Mercer, sit down if you like. Wade sat. They were quiet for a moment, looking at the street. The ordinary afternoon of a town that had just done something hard and was returning to its surface routines while underneath everything was different. The marshal will be here Thursday or Friday, Ambrose said. I expect he'll move quickly. The documentation is clean and the witnesses are credible. He turned a page in his notebook. Rourke will claim the journal is fabricated. He'll claim the witnesses are coordinating a false account. It won't hold, but he'll make it unpleasant for a while. I know, Wade said. Your wife, Ambrose said, looking at the notebook, made the difference today. The timing was critical. If this had gone to a formal proceeding without the public moment, Rourke would have had time to manage the narrative. He's good at managing narratives. She understood the timing better than I did, Wade said. She was willing to move without waiting for everything to be perfect, Ambrose said. That's rarer than it sounds. Wade was quiet for a moment. She sat in front of me on my porch with her hat in her hands, he said, and told me she needed a husband, and she was practical about it and honest about it, and she scared me slightly. Ambrose glanced at him sidelong. Did she? The good kind of scared, Wade said. The kind that means something is real. The old man considered that. You know, he said, in 40 years on the circuit, I saw a great many cases. Corruption, land disputes, violence, theft, all manner of human failing. He closed his notebook. The cases that actually resolved, not just legally but actually, were almost always the ones where more than one person decided the same thing was worth the risk at the same time. He looked at the street. You and your wife decided that. Your witnesses decided it. Even that deputy. What's his name? Flass. Even Flass. Whatever he does now, whatever he decides about his future, he'll have to decide it knowing what he saw today. He stood slowly, with his joints announcing their opinions. People surprise you sometimes, Mr. Mercer. Not always pleasantly, but sometimes. Sophia came out of the Mercantile behind them, carrying a second cup of coffee, which she handed to Wade without comment, and then sat down on his other side. He passed it back to her because he'd already had enough, and she accepted it without discussion. The three of them sat on the bench outside Navarro's Mercantile in the late afternoon light of Red Creek, Texas. And the street was quiet now, and in the sheriff's office at the end of the block, Calvin Rourke sat alone behind his desk with the particular stillness of a man who has spent years building something that has just come down around him and is not yet able to fully take in the size of what he has lost. Wade looked at his hands. He thought about the loose floorboard in his bedroom, which was now empty. He thought about 4 months of watching and writing and waiting, and the 7 weeks since Sophia had ridden up his road on a bay mare and said she needed a husband. He thought about the fence he still had to rebuild on the north pasture, the cattle he still needed to get back from Curtis's pen, the accounts ledger and Henderson's persistent arithmetic problems. The spare room that was someone's room now, not storage. The work was waiting. It was always waiting, but it was different now. The waiting was different. The work would be different. And he sat with that for a moment in the fading light without trying to name it more precisely than that. Beside him, Sophia finished the coffee and set the cup on the bench. The north fence, she said. I know, he said. We should get lumber ordered before the weekend. I'll go to the mill tomorrow, he said. Voss will give us a fair price. She nodded. They sat a little longer. The territorial marshal arrived on Friday. His name was Calhoun, and he came with 2 deputies and the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this kind of work before and had learned that urgency and speed were not the same thing. He was maybe 50, weathered in the way of men who spent their lives on horseback, and he had a quality of compressed authority that was different from Rourke's performing kind. quieter, more certain of itself, needing no audience. He went directly to Ambrose first, which told Wade something about how seriously the old judge's telegraph had been received. They spoke for 2 hours in the back room of the Mercantile, which had become, without anyone formally deciding it, the operational center of everything. Wade sat in on part of it. Sophia sat in on all of it, with the accounts ledger and the documented records organized in front of her. And she answered Calhoun's questions with the same precise directness she brought to everything. And Wade watched Calhoun's expression shift incrementally from professional reserve to something closer to genuine attention. 4 years, Calhoun said at one point, looking at Ernesto's payment records. 4 years, 2 months, Ernesto said from the corner where he had been sitting quietly. I missed 1 month in the second year. They sent someone to explain why that wasn't acceptable. He paused. I didn't miss another. Calhoun looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the records again. I'll need all of this, he said. It's yours, Ernesto said. The arrest happened that same afternoon, without theater and without incident, which surprised some people and didn't surprise others. Calhoun walked into the sheriff's office with both his deputies and a federal warrant, and Calvin Rourke, who had spent 3 days behind his desk in a state of increasingly thin composure, watching his options narrow, stood up when they came in and said nothing. He looked at the warrant. He looked at Calhoun's face. He seemed to do some final calculation. Whatever he calculated, it told him the same thing the street had told him 3 days earlier. He put his hands out. Cole, the broad deputy, was brought in separately and charged as an accessory. He cooperated immediately and completely, with the eager speed of a man who understands that the first person to talk gets the best terms. What he said filled in several gaps in the record and added 2 additional incidents that Wade hadn't known about. Flass was questioned but not charged. There was not enough to charge him, and Calhoun was precise about the line between complicity and proximity. Flass sat in the questioning with the expression of a man who had escaped something he hadn't entirely deserved to escape, and who was going to spend some time living with that. Wade thought that was probably the right outcome. Not justice exactly, but something in its neighborhood. Rourke was transported out of Red Creek that evening in handcuffs, in the back of Calhoun's wagon. A fair number of people watched him go. Not a crowd this time. Not the charged assembly of 3 days earlier, but a scattered, quiet line of people on the sidewalk and at windows, watching a man who had ruled their lives through fear be taken away in chains, and feeling something that was too complicated to be simple satisfaction. Martha Greer watched from her laundry doorway. Thomas Aldridge watched from the street. Del Saunders, who had said out loud that picking a fight with the sheriff carried a cost, watched from the edge of the saloon porch with his hat in his hands and the specific expression of a man who is assessing his own record and not finding it entirely satisfactory. Wade watched from the street. He stood with Sophia beside him, and he watched the wagon roll down Main Street and turn at the East Road. And he felt the stone that had been living in his chest since the morning 3 weeks ago when Rourke's men had moved his cattle markers. He felt it come loose and drop away, and the absence of it was almost disorienting. He had been carrying it long enough that the weight had become normal. It's done, Sophia said. The arrest is, he said. There's still the trial. That's not here. That's not ours. He looked at her. The trial is Calhoun's problem, she said, and Ambrose's. We have work. He almost laughed. She said it with such complete practicality, the way she said most things, and there was something in that practicality that he had come to find genuinely comforting, not because it avoided the emotional weight of things, but because it assumed that the emotional weight was real and accounted for, and you could still function inside it. We have work, he agreed. The lumber came from Voss's mill on Monday at a price that was, as Wade had predicted, fair. He and Pierce spent 4 days rebuilding the north fence, which was longer than it needed to be in terms of man-hours. But Pierce had shown up Monday morning with tools and the air of a man who intended to be useful, and Wade was not going to turn away help he hadn't asked for. They worked mostly without talking, the way men work when they are comfortable with each other, and the task is clear. And by Thursday, the fence was better than it had been before it was burned, which was something. The cattle came back from Curtis's property through an official process that involved Calhoun's office and a county adjudicator and considerably more paperwork than the original theft, which Wade thought was about right for how these things worked. All 31 came back. One of them had a minor leg injury from being moved rough, and one was pregnant, which was a development that had nothing to do with Rourke but was pleasing regardless. Curtis himself was a separate and complicated matter. He had been cooperating with Rourke for 2 years, but the nature of that cooperation turned out to be more fear than greed. Rourke had leverage on him from an earlier land dispute, and when that leverage was removed, the man seemed to deflate, like something that had been held up by pressure and couldn't stand on its own. He came to Wade's ranch one morning, uninvited, and stood at the gate, and Wade went out to meet him. He was a slight man, younger than Wade had expected, with the burnt-out look of someone who hadn't slept well in a long time. "I know there's nothing I can say," Curtis said. "No," Wade agreed. "I want to give back what I can. The grazing boundary with Pierce, whatever needs signing, I'll sign." Wade looked at him for a moment. "Pierce will want to hear that from you directly," he said. "I know." Curtis looked at his hat. "I know he will." "Go see him," Wade said. "Today, not next week." Curtis nodded and rode away, and Wade watched him go and felt the complexity of the situation settle on him. The way real events don't organize themselves into clean categories of villain and victim, how people get caught in the machinery of someone else's corruption and come out ground down and smaller, and what you do with that. He didn't forgive Curtis. He also didn't feel particularly interested in punishing him further. Some people were just too broken to be useful enemies. He went back to the fence. Pierce came by that evening, and Wade told him about Curtis. Pierce was quiet for a long moment. "He'll sign the papers?" Pierce said. "He said so." "That's my land," Pierce said, not with anger, just with the factual weight of someone naming something true. 2 years I've been without it." "I know." Pierce looked out at the pasture. "I'll go see him," he said. "But I'm not shaking his hand." "You don't have to shake his hand," Wade said. "You just need his signature." Pierce went the next day. The papers were signed. The county adjudicator processed the boundary correction within 2 weeks, which was, as these things went, remarkably fast. Wade suspected Calhoun had made a call. The question of Red Creek's sheriff was resolved by the county appointing a temporary deputy from the Millfield office while a proper election was organized. The temporary deputy was a woman in her 40s named Ruth Galloway, who had worked law enforcement for 12 years and who arrived in Red Creek with a calm professionalism that was so different from Rourke's performing authority that people weren't quite sure how to relate to her at first. She asked reasonable questions and enforced reasonable things and didn't take money from anyone. And gradually, as weeks passed, people adjusted to what law enforcement looked like when it was functioning the way it was supposed to. The informal tax stopped, obviously, completely, immediately. Several merchants who had been paying it came forward in the weeks after Rourke's arrest to add their accounts to the official record, including 2 that Wade hadn't known about. And the cumulative figure that Calhoun's office eventually compiled was a number large enough that even people who had suspected the scale of things were surprised by it. Hector Flass left Red Creek in the 3rd week after the arrest. He came to the ranch the morning he left, which surprised Wade, and he stood at the gate in his civilian clothes with his horse loaded and his badge gone from his chest. "I'm going back to Millfield," he said. "My mother's place." "All right," Wade said. "I wanted to—" Flass stopped, started again. "I knew it wasn't right. What he was doing, I knew it for a long time." "I know you did," Wade said. "I didn't do anything about it." "No." Flass looked at him, seemed to want something from the exchange that Wade wasn't going to provide. Some absolution, some statement that it was understandable, some release from the specific weight of having known and done nothing. Wade wasn't going to give him that because it wasn't his to give, and because Flass was going to have to carry it himself, the way people carry these things. And the carrying was the only thing that might eventually make him better. "You talked to me through the cell door," Flass said. "I did." "You said that was how it always worked. Men who looked the other way for someone bad." "Yes." Flass nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that." "Good," Wade said. "Keep thinking about it." Flass rode away, and Wade watched him go, and he felt that the young man might be all right eventually. Not because of anything he'd done or said, but because Flass had come to say it at all, which meant he was at least facing the right direction. The wedding reception, the real one, the community one, the celebration that the 8-person courthouse ceremony had deliberately skipped, was held 6 weeks after Rourke's arrest, on a Saturday in early autumn when the heat had broken enough to make outdoor gathering tolerable. It had not been Wade's idea. It had not been entirely Sophia's idea either. It had emerged from the town the way certain things emerge from communities that have been through something together, organically, collectively, without a single organizing hand. Martha Greer had mentioned it to Ernesto, who mentioned it to Pierce, who apparently said something to Thomas Aldridge. And somewhere in that chain of mentions, it became a plan, and then it became a fact, and Wade and Sophia were informed rather than consulted. Wade had mild objections, which Sophia overruled with 4 words. Let them do it. He thought about that for a moment. All right, he said. It was held in the field behind the mercantile, which was large enough for the crowd that showed up, which was larger than either of them expected. Nearly the whole town, it seemed, or near enough that the exceptions were the exceptions and not the rule. Tables borrowed from the church hall. Food brought by what seemed like every woman in Red Creek who owned a pot, which produced an abundance of dishes that were not uniformly excellent, but were offered with such genuine warmth that the quality was beside the point. Pierce came. Voss came with his wife, a small, energetic woman who hugged Sophia on arrival with the assumption of existing friendship, and Sophia, to her own apparent surprise, hugged her back without hesitation. Holland and Dietz came. Aldridge came and brought a bottle of something better than the occasion probably required, and pressed it into Wade's hands with a look that said more than his words did. Even Ambrose was there, having delayed his return to Millfield at Claire Hawes' suggestion. They arrived together and stayed the whole evening, and Ambrose ate 3 plates of food and seemed entirely content about it. Ernesto Navarro moved through the gathering with a quality Wade had not seen in him before. A looseness, an ease. The compact, precise man who controlled his workspace and his emotions, and his records had somewhere set down a thing he had been carrying, and the setting down had left him lighter. He laughed at something Pierce said. A real laugh, unguarded. He danced with his daughter to the fiddle music someone had organized, awkwardly, the way fathers dance with daughters. And Sophia looked both embarrassed and thoroughly happy about it, which was its own kind of wonderful to see. Wade stood at the edge of it for a while, watching. He was not a man who was comfortable being celebrated. He had lived too long in the habit of invisibility to find public attention anything but slightly disorienting. People came to him throughout the evening, shook his hand, said things that were warm and genuine and sometimes slightly too large for him to know how to receive. And he accepted all of it as graciously as he knew how, which was not always gracefully. And he was honest enough with himself to recognize that the discomfort was not the whole of what he felt. He also felt, somewhere underneath the discomfort, something that he did not have a precise word for and did not try to name too directly. Something like belonging. Something like being seen by a place, which was different from being seen by a person. Wider, less personal, and in some ways more disorienting for that. He had lived in this county for 11 years. He had worked this land and paid his debts and kept his word and said please and thank you at the mercantile counter, and all of that time he had told himself that what he had was enough. The work, the land, the quiet. That wanting more was a kind of foolishness he had outgrown. He had been wrong about that, he understood now. Not wrong that the work was real or that the land mattered. Wrong that those things were sufficient. Wrong that a person could build something solid in isolation and call it complete. He had been building half a thing, and he had not known it was half because he had never seen the whole. Sophia found him at the edge of the gathering late in the evening, when the fiddle had quieted and the children who had come with their parents were asleep in the wagon beds, and the adults were in that loose, warm stage of a long evening where conversation slows and people start thinking about the road home. She stood beside him and looked at the gathering, at the people of Red Creek in the autumn dark with lanterns going, and the low sound of conversation moving through the air. "You're counting the ways this could have gone wrong," she said. "I'm not," he said. And then, honestly, not anymore. She looked at him. "It did go wrong," she said. "Several times, the cattle, the fence, the arrest, several things went wrong. Yes. But the foundation held," she said, simply, without triumph in it. He looked at her profile in the lantern light. This woman who had ridden up his road with a proposal and a problem and an honesty that had scared him in the way that real things scare you. Not the fear of danger, but the fear of something that matters. He thought about what her father had told him on the courthouse steps. She holds things close. You will have to earn the inside of it. He thought he was beginning to, slowly. He thought it was going to take longer than 6 weeks, and he thought that was fine. Some things were better for taking time. "Sophia," he said. "Yes. I want to say something, and I don't want you to be practical about it for 30 seconds. She looked at him. "That's a high bar." "I know." He looked at the gathering, then back at her. "I spent 11 years being sure I was the kind of person a full life happened around rather than 2. I had good reasons for thinking that. I had evidence." He paused. "You rode up my road and proved the evidence wrong, and I want you to know I understand what that cost you to do. I'm not going to forget it." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was slightly different from its usual quality. Not softer exactly, but less armored. "You said yes," she said, without hesitation. "I thought about it all night." "One night," she said, "and then yes." She looked at her hands. "I had calculated for refusal. I had a second option if you said no. Someone else I was going to ask." She paused. "I was glad I didn't need it." "Who was the second option?" "Aldridge." He looked over at Thomas Aldridge, who was across the gathering telling what appeared to be a long and elaborate story to Pearson Voss. "He would have said yes," Wade said. "Probably," Sophia said. "But he talks too much." This time he actually laughed. A real one, unguarded, the kind that came out before he could decide about it. And she looked at him with an expression he was still learning to read, which was the expression of a person who is letting themselves be glad about something without making a performance of it. Ernesto appeared at their side with 2 cups and handed one to each of them without being asked. "The fiddle player wants to know if you want more music," he said. "Yes," Sophia said. "No," Wade said at the same time. Ernesto looked between them. "I will tell him, maybe," he said, with the perfect diplomatic timing of a man who had managed 2 stubborn people for years, and walked away. The fiddle played one more song, which was a compromise, and then people began finding their wagons and their horses, and the long process of a large gathering unwinding began. People saying goodbyes that ran longer than necessary because nobody quite wanted to be the first one to leave a night that had been, in the plain and unadorned sense of the word, good. They got home late. The ranch was dark when they pulled up, and Wade lit the lantern on the porch while Sophia got down from the wagon, and the windmill was turning in a light breeze, and the cattle in the south pasture were quiet, and the rebuilt fence on the north line stood straight and solid in the dark. He looked at the fence for a moment. 4 days of work with Pierce, better than the original. There was something in that. Not a moral exactly, more an observation about the nature of things that get broken and get rebuilt. Sometimes the rebuilt version is just a rebuilt version and carries the scar of what was lost. Sometimes you do it right, and it comes out stronger than it started. He wasn't sure which category this fence fell into. He wasn't sure which category most things fell into. Life, he had learned, did not organize itself into clean lessons. It just accumulated. Work and loss and unexpected arrivals and mornings that started before sunrise and evenings that ended later than expected, and the long, slow discovery that the things you built in isolation were incomplete not because they were badly made, but because they were made for one. And the world, at some point, had more than one person in it. Sophia was at the door, waiting. "Wade," she said. "Coming," he said. He took one more look at the ranch, the fence, the pasture, the windmill turning in the dark, and he thought about 11 years of mornings and the quality of the silence they had carried and how the silence now was different, had a different texture, was inhabited in a way it hadn't been before. He thought about the woman who had told her neighbor that some men were not meant to have a family. He thought about how he had stood in the next aisle with a sack of flour and let that sentence settle into him, and how he had filed it away and tried not to think about it. He had been wrong to believe it. He had been wrong, and the wrongness had been corrected not by fate or luck, but by a woman on a bay mare who had done her research and made a proposal and refused, at every point, to accept the situation she had been given as a situation that couldn't be changed. That was the thing, he thought. That was the actual thing. Not that it had worked out. Not that the corrupt man was arrested and the cattle came back and the town showed up with food and a fiddle. Those were the results, and results were real and mattered, but they were not the thing. The thing was the decision. The decision to not accept what was being done to you as permanent. The decision to build something even when you were building it alone and nobody was watching. The decision to ride up a stranger's road and say what you needed and ask for help because what you needed was real and worth asking for. He had made his version of that decision, and so had she, and so had Pierce and Voss and Holland and Dietz and Ernesto with his box of records, and even Ambrose in his plain brown suit making himself available from retirement because someone had asked. None of them had been heroic about it. All of them had been afraid at various points. All of them had hesitated, calculated, waited too long, moved too fast, gotten things wrong. That was what it had actually looked like from the inside. Not a story about courage, a story about people who were tired of the alternative. He put out the porch lantern and went inside. The house was warm and smelled like the food they had brought back from the gathering. Half a pie that Ernesto had pressed on them, something wrapped in cloth that Mrs. Greer had given Sophia at the end of the night. The kitchen was the particular comfortable disorder of a house that two people live in, which is different in texture and feel from the order of a house that one person keeps. He had not noticed that difference until he had it to compare to. Sophia was already in the hallway. "Henderson's invoice came yesterday," she said. "I left it on the table. I'll look at it in the morning." "There's a discrepancy again, $8. "Of course there is." She went to her room. He went to his. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the familiar sounds of the house, the windmill, the cattle, the creaks of the old timber. And underneath those familiar sounds, the small sounds of another person settling in at the end of a long day. It was a good sound. He had not known, before, that it would be. He closed his eyes. Outside, Red Creek settled into the quiet of a late autumn night, and the north fence stood straight in the dark. And the 31 cattle, plus one pregnant, whose calf would arrive before winter, moved slow and indifferent through the south pasture, and the windmill turned in a steady breeze that came down off the ridge and moved across the county and touched everything in it equally, the way weather does. Wade Mercer slept without difficulty. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.